The internet is awash with conspiracy theories about fake moon landings, reptilian presidents, and secret mind control programs. But for every tinfoil tale and made-up mystery, there are plenty of conspiracies that genuinely did take place. From racist sterilizations and experiments through to fabricated reasons for war. Here are 7 real government conspiracies. In at 7, COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was a counterintelligence program run by the FBI with the aim of monitoring, infiltrating, and destroying minority political organizations in the United States. Any group deemed subversive was targeted and smeared, including anti-Vietnam War demonstrators, feminist organizations, Native Americans, anti-colonial organizations, and the civil rights movement. This program was exposed in 1971 when a group called Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI burgled a Pennsylvania field office and discovered documents covering these atrocious acts. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and the Black Panther Party were targeted by COINTELPRO Chief William C. Sullivan, who took orders directly from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Within days of Martin Luther King's speech at the 1963 March on Washington, Sullivan wrote the following: "We must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security." COINTELPRO's tactics included bugging and trailing Martin Luther King everywhere he went, blackmailing him with a recording of his sexual exploits, and even sending a letter to his home in an attempt to convince him to commit suicide. Number 6. Tuskegee. The Tuskegee experiment secretly infected nearly 400 African American men with syphilis between 1932 and 1972 in a program directly backed by the U.S. Public Health Service. Their aim was to see if black men coped better than white guys with the disease, because obviously that's a great reason to go around giving people a serious sexual infection. Good job, science jerks. The men in question were told they had bad blood. Something of an understatement, don't you think? And shockingly, none of them were informed of their infectious state, meaning the disease was also unknowingly transmitted to their partners. By the end of the experiment in 1972, only 74 of those infected were still alive. In at 5, the case for war. This is a girl called Naria. And in 1990, she gave a moving testimony to Congress about how she witnessed invading Iraqi soldiers dumping newborn babies out of their incubators in her home country of Kuwait, leaving them to die in filth on the floor. Her story helped garner support for an invasion of Iraq, led by then-President George Herbert Walker Bush. But there was just one problem with Naria's account of Iraqi atrocities. It was about as truthful as the guys caught on To Catch a Predator turning up to a kid's house with a bottle of wine and a 6-pack of condoms. "No, of course I don't find children attractive, Mr. Hanson. I brought the wine for communion. I'm a religious man, you see." "Oh, the condoms? That's going to make a balloon sculpture of our Lord Jesus Christ." It later transpired that Naria's full name was Naria al-Sabah, daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Her testimony was paid for by American PR firm Hill & Knowlton on behalf of the Kuwaiti government. So while it was certainly true that Iraqi soldiers had invaded the country on behalf of Saddam Hussein and that babies had died in Kuwait because of the conflict, Naria's false testimony about the brutality of the Iraqi army was merely intended to be a final sales pitch to persuade America to buy into yet another foreign war. In at number 4, bad booze. Between 1920 and 1933, the United States was drier than an April Ludgate comeback after a mouthful of crackers. Prohibition was in full swing, and even though stiff penalties were in place for those who drank or made alcoholic beverages, many people continued to get wasted in secret by purifying industrial alcohol. But the Calvin Coolidge administration didn't approve of this. So, to persuade the public of the error of their ways, they began adding impurities to industrial alcohol to make it even more poisonous, hoping nobody would consume it. Coolidge really didn't understand what booze hounds would do for a drink, did he? 10% methanol was added to industrial alcohol, as was ammonia, formaldehyde, arsenic, acetone, and kerosene. And as a result, many people across the U.S. died, with most unaware of the new formula's deadly effects, leading one Democratic senator to call Calvin Coolidge's actions legalized murder. At 3. Compulsory sterilization. Denmark, Norway, the USA, Switzerland, Estonia, Iceland, Britain, Panama. What's the link? They're all terrible at soccer? No, because Iceland clearly rocks at the moment. I'm afraid the clue was in the title, because each of these countries has at some point enforced sterilization programs on its citizens. These programs were often linked to belief in eugenics, which is the idea that undesirable people should be prevented from breeding. This label has been applied to the disabled, homosexuals, those with low IQ, and communists. But in the USA, sterilization was focused on one particular trait. Can you guess what it is? Of course you can. It's race. Between the end of World War I and 1965, 30% of all Puerto Rican women were rendered infertile, thanks to forced or coerced sterilization backed by the U.S. government. And another campaign aimed primarily at low-income women and those of color was enacted by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. Between 1973 and 1976, over 3,000 Native American women were sterilized without consent, and nearly 20,000 women, mostly Latino and Black, were sterilized in California between 1909 and 1979, a campaign which led to a class action lawsuit by working-class Mexican women who were often coerced into the procedure by doctors moments after giving birth. At 2. Dirty dealing. In 1996, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Gary Webb published a series of books and articles in a series called Dark Alliance, where he exposed links between the CIA and Central American right-wing groups called the Contras. The Contras were assisted by the CIA in smuggling drugs for sale into the United States so that their profits could be used to overthrow left-wing governments across Central America. Los Angeles gangs, such as the Crips and Bloods, were hooked up with cocaine. And an investigation by the Justice Department and the House Select Committee found that several prominent dealers had been directly aided by CIA operatives. Gary Webb also noted that many of the neighborhoods targeted by drug dealers were poor and Black, because apparently creating a crack-infested city rife with crime in your own backyard is an acceptable side effect for enabling right-wing regime change in Central America. Oh, and in 2004, Gary Webb was found dead, with police reporting he'd killed himself. Except rarely is it possible for a gunshot suicide victim to put 2 bullets in their own head. The first bullet usually makes you a little woozy, at best. And number 1, The Case for War, Part 2. In the early 2000s, the UK Parliament was deliberating whether to join the US in an invasion of Iraq. But a recently concluded investigation 7 years in the making has outlined a shocking conspiracy regarding the war between 2 of the world's major former leaders, George W. Bush and Tony Blair. The report by Sir John Chilcot is hefty reading, with a 2.6 million word count covering every aspect of the decision-making process and subsequent aftermath of the Iraq War. Its most startling revelation was that Tony Blair had already given George W. Bush his word that the UK would join the war in Iraq, even before Parliament had discussed any other options. Democracy shamocracy. Huh, Tony? Other conclusions inferred that Saddam Hussein did not pose a threat to British interests, that evidence of weapons of mass destruction was over-exaggerated, that no peaceful options were explored, and that both the UK and US had undermined the authority of the United Nations. The Iraq War has been under scrutiny in the UK for many years, and in our video on 7 mysteriously slain scientists, we covered the possible murder of Dr. David Kelly, a weapons expert who spoke out against the war, and who later died in suspicious circumstances. It is clear that many in the US and UK governments wanted this war to take place, despite the public demanding the opposite. On February 15, 2003, nearly 30 million people marched in locations around the world to protest the invasion plans, including 1 million in London, 1.5 million in Madrid, and 3 million in Rome. But by the time anyone took to the streets, the decision had already been made. So, with millions dead, terror attacks inspired around the world, and ISIS filling the Middle East power vacuum, is it time for Bush and Blair to stand trial for war crimes? Yes. Or at the very least, they should be marched naked down the street while we all shout, "Shame, shame." So that's our list of 7 real government conspiracies. What's the only thing more intriguing than a government conspiracy? One set in space, of course. So why not watch our recent video all about cosmic conspiracies? And get that image of a naked Blair and Bush out of your mind.